Good afternoon. Thank you for logging into this meeting of the Children, Young People and Family Support Scrutiny Committee. I'm Jason Deach. I'm the Democratic Services Officer for the meeting, and Kate Sheldon is the host for the meeting. This is a public meeting in line with the regulations that allow us to hold meetings remotely, and it's going to be live streamed for the public to view. To make the meeting as smooth as possible, can I please ask people to leave their microphones on mute when they're not speaking? And when you want to speak, please raise your hand to the camera and then unmute when the chair indicates that you can speak. And if at any time a member loses connection and the ability to hear and be heard, they must alert the chair and the host as soon as possible. And finally, you may see members looking at either side of their screens. That's because they're looking at paperwork relating to the meeting containing agenda papers, and not because they're distracted. I will now hand over to the chair of the meeting, Councillor Rooney.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you to everyone for their attendance this afternoon, and also to anyone who might be listening to us or watching us, rather. Not to try and contradict Jason, but it would make it easier from my point of view if people could use the chat button or the chat facility, which is at the bottom of your screen, and just say, question please, or I'd like to speak please, because I'm not sure that during these proceedings, I'm going to be able to see everybody at the same time, and I've already got, I believe, 2 screens. I have, yeah, I've got 2 screens to look at. So in terms of asking questions or making a contribution, could you use the chat, please? And I will keep an eye on that. And first of all, does everybody know where it is? I'm getting nods. Nobody's saying no. I'll just look at the other screen. Everybody seems happy on that screen, so I think we're okay with that. Right, back, so that's that. In terms of, for the general public's point of view, I think it's best that we say who we are. These are in no particular order, they're just as they are on the screen in front of me, and they might be in a different order from what members are seeing. So I'm going to start with Cliff.
Good afternoon, I'm Councillor Cliff Woodcraft, elected member for Forward.
Alison.
I'm Healthwatch Sheffield representative and observer.
Thank you, Alice. Now we'll try Alison.
I'm Alison Warner. I'm a governor representative.
Thank you. Jason?
I'm Jason Deach, Democratic Services.
Alan?
Alan Law, first part.
Sophie?
Hi, I'm Sophie Wilson, member for Bayton Ward.
Sam?
I'm Sam Evans, I'm the Darson representative.
Julie? Oh, there's
Good
only
afternoon,
one.
everyone. I'm Julie Greencook, Councillor for Stocksbridge and Upper.
Kevin?
Hello everyone, I'm Councillor Kevin Oxley, representing Mosville Ward.
Alice? Nicholson?
Hi, I'm Alice Nicholson. I'm the Policy and Improvement Officer who supports this committee.
Colin?
Councillor Colin Ross, member for Dore and Totley Ward.
Khartoum?
Thank you. Councillor Carlton Rivers, a councillor for Broomhill and Sharon Vale, and today subbing for Councillor Alison Teal.
And you may disappear every now and again to look after your children.
Yes.
So that's why Khartoum might disappear. Andrew?
Yeah. Councillor Andrew Sanger, Councillor for Forward Ward, subbing today for Councillor Joe Watton.
Thank you very much. Mike?
Councillor Mike Levery, member for West Ecclesfield and Deputy Chair of this committee.
Jim?
Councillor Jim Stanky for another urgent Sharrow, and I have to give apologies. I may have to leave before the end of the meeting.
Okay.
Yep.
Sasha,
I
and
am.
a special welcome to yourself.
Thank you. I'm Sasha Schofield. I'm head teacher at Bents Green Special School.
Alice, would you like another go? Alice?
Sorry, I thought I'm Health Watch Sheffield representative and observer.
Okay. I've got Joanne Bradshaw on my screen, but I can't actually see her. Hello.
Hello, I'm Joanne Bradshaw and I'm Chief Exec at Sheffield South East Trust.
Thank you very much. Anne?
Councillor Anne Murphy for Crooks and Crosspool, subbing for one of my colleagues this afternoon.
Stephen?
Stephen Betts from Learn Sheffield.
Francine?
Hello there, sorry about that. I'm Francine Johnson for Stocksbridge and Upper Donwood.
Mike C.
Hello, I'm Mike Chaplin, councillor for Southey Ward.
Kathy?
Hi, I'm head teacher of Dobcroft Nursery Infant School at Millhouses.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to go on to the other page to see if I've missed anybody. Andrew?
Hi, I'm Andrew Jones. I'm Sheffield City Council's Interim Director of Education and Skills.
And last but by no means least, Abtisam.
Thank you. Councillor Abtisam Mohammed, Cabinet Member for Education and Skills.
Thank you. That's everyone introduced. Now, I think I've done the housekeeping arrangements in the sense of about the voting and wanting to speak. The only other thing I think I've got in those terms is that the idea is to go through the item 7, allowing Stephen and our friends from the schools and the reps who are representing schools to have their say before we actually go into a question session. And can I just say, please be open and honest and frank. This is not an attempt to trip you up. It's not an attempt to try and make you look inadequate or anything like that. It's simply to try and get a proper hold as your representatives of how you've coped with this situation for the last, 8 months or so. So please feel free to speak freely, okay? Bear with me, I'm looking at all sorts of different bits of paper. Right, yes, Alice.
It seems that Chris French has just joined us, who's from one of the schools. So you might like to let him to introduce himself.
Okay. I'm assuming he's on page 2.
Yep.
Chris
hi.
French, page 2. Hello.
Hello, Chris French here, CEO of Mercy Learning Trust, 3 primaries, 3 secondaries in the southwest.
And I should say thank you to all of the teachers for taking out time to visit us at a very busy and difficult time. So thank you very much indeed for that. Right, page 1. Apologies, please.
Yeah, I've got apologies from councillors Joe Otten, Alison Teal and Gary Weatherall, I think, and subs have been appointed as we've run through. Peter Nowdrett also sends apologies.
Thank you. Okay, item 3 says exclusion of press and public. We're not going to do that. Any declarations of interest on today's agenda? Can't see. Sam?
I don't know if it quite hits the threshold, but I'm the Chief Executive of the Philadelphia Network Limited and a trustee of it. We run Essex Food Bank, and we're also involved separately in the Holiday Hunger Programme, which is mentioned in item 7. So just for completeness.
We'll note it, but I don't think it's prejudicial. It's just always best to just get it on the record just in case. Anybody on the second page? I can. No one else? Right. In terms of the minutes, what I'm going to do is take them all, the first lot, as en masse, as a correct record. So is everybody happy to accept the minutes of the 21st of May as a correct record? Oh, chat. I've got something on chat. Hang on, what is it? Oh, it's Sam. Okay.
That was me, although I've got an item on this one. So I'll just say that it says I was involved, but I'm actually the director of the parent charity to Forge Youth. I've already emailed that in, so it should be consistent.
We'll get there eventually, Sam, with the correct wording. It's not going to be a serious. It's not a serious issue. We just need to sort out the right wording for it. That's all. Okay. Right. Are you happy to take those as a correct record, the people that were there? If you want to, if no, can you just do something on chat? And I'll take a few seconds. No, everybody seems happy with that. Oh, Mike, sorry. Go on.
Sorry, I'm fiddling around with chat. Item 5.5 states that the youth services contract was a 50-year contract. It's not, it's 15.
Right.
Just
slip of the pen, hopefully. But other than that, are we happy with them? We seem to be. Okay, thank you. Now we'll go through matters arising. And I've got like page 9. And then look on the other side. No. And again, I think if there is an issue, the best way to do it is through chat. Okay, so 10. Uh, 11. Aptisam, there's a question. Aptisam said that she would give a detailed answer to Miss Peters, I believe, and I'm just wondering, Aptisam, if you managed that.
I believe it's been done. It's been sent out. I'll double check on that, Chair.
Now, would it be possible for us to have a look at it, please, as members of the? I'm always interested to what exactly the answers are that were given. Yeah.
Yep, that's fine.
Thank you. All right. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. Okay, thank you very much. Now we've got a set of minutes from the 26th of June. Again, are you happy to take them as a correct record collectively? Just nod or make some sort of sign or whatever. Be nice. Give it a lack of activity. I'll take the lack of activity as acquiescence. Okay, now we'll go through matters arising again. Page 19. 20. Oh, 4.2. There is a piece of work that's referenced in these minutes, 4.2, that Jim and a number of other people were involved in, which was the voice and influence of young people. And I am absolutely determined that we will not lose that piece of work simply because at this moment in time, we can't really push it forward. So Alice seems to be wanting to say something, so I will stand aside for that.
No, just to say that I have, as you know, some of the people we deal with who support the Youth Council are now part of the in-house service, and I have been in touch with them to raise this up and absolutely keen to establish where we were in terms of youth council work and youth voice. And we're having conversations already about possible item for next agenda. So it's not been lost, it has been resurrected.
And while we're at it, we are also very keen to continue the work with CAMS and scrutinising that. So that is on the, I believe, on the work programme, yes, for discussion later. Is that correct? Yeah, okay. And the only other thing that I can think of, just to prove that I do read them, John McElwraith promised to give some detailed answers to Helen Thompson, and I don't know whether that actually happened. Does anybody? No. Alice, yeah.
I don't know if it's happened, but I have chased that one up for you. So it's quite possible it has. I'm chasing it up, that's all.
All right, thank you. Is there anything else on those minutes? No. Okay, I'll go back to the agenda. And again, sincere apologies for this, but I'm having to flick from various bits of paper and various machines. Public questions, Alice? There are none. Okay, right. Item 7, return to school, etc., etc. Can I ask Stephen to try and keep the item relatively short, because we have seen the slides. There's a lot of them, and I wouldn't particularly want you to go through every single one of them, but at the same time, try and bring out the salient points. And I'm sure when our educational colleagues join in after that, they'll tell you whether or not they agree with you. Okay, Stephen, can I stop talking now and let you have a go?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, Andrew's leading the presentation, so I'll pass over to Andrew if that's okay.
I hope he heard all that.
I'm sure he did.
Yes, thank you. And you'll be pleased to know, Chair, that I've already said to Alice I'm not going to put the slides up and go through them. I'll just talk through some key highlights from them. So first of all, obviously, it's been an extremely challenging situation for all schools, education providers and childcare providers across the city from March. It's been an incredible time for them, and I have to say, I have to give praise right from the outset for the way in which school leaders and other education leaders and childcare providers have responded throughout. Everybody has actually stayed open throughout the pandemic. There's been lots of talk at various points of schools closing, and in reality, all of them are actually kept open throughout the pandemic, continued to make provision for children in the city. And that's obviously important in terms of the quality of what they do with the children, but also in relation to their parents, enabling and facilitating their parents to get to work as well as part of that. We've worked very closely with colleagues in Learn Sheffield in terms of taking quite a direct lead with schools and other settings within the council. And that includes not only schools and settings within Sheffield. I'm just getting some feedback somewhere.
Somebody's got a radio or something on. I'm not sure who it might be. I have a suspicion.
But what I wanted to get across to the committee is the fact that we've actually worked closely with school, wherever there is a Sheffield child, that includes some schools and educational organisations out of the city. We've worked very closely and carefully with them. As the committee will be aware, although the government asked for schools to reopen from the 1st of June, our own Director of Public Health decided that the time wasn't right on the 1st of June, and provided advice and an instruction to our maintained schools that they should delay any wider opening until the 15th of June, which then took place for additional groups in primary schools and also some in secondaries as well. I won't, as you've suggested, Chair, go through all the slides, but between us, the Council and Learn Sheffield have provided support to schools and settings on a wide variety of fronts by a wide variety of colleagues. It really has been a whole council response to supporting schools in the pandemic. A key agency within that has been our own public health team, who have throughout provided direct, ongoing support to schools, including advice where infections arise in schools and settings, and actually making sure that actually the guidance which has been issued makes sense to people and is also in a format which is easy for them to follow. And it would be invidious to pick any individual team or group out, but I would like to pay particular respect to the public health team in Sheffield, who've done absolutely amazing work. They literally are working 7 days a week. They are speaking to schools all the time, day and night, in terms of providing the support, and that continues at the moment. In relation to public health guidance to schools, it's a little bit of a mixed picture on that, in that schools, when they have an incidence of coronavirus, can now either report it to Public Health England directly, to the DfE directly, or to our local public health team. And it is in itself actually a task for head teachers to try and navigate which of those three options to actually take. I've also raised with the DfE this week a phenomena that's arisen this week, which is that the DfE helpline has also now started to say to head teachers that if they are comfortable with making their own decisions about public health matters in their school, they don't actually have to speak to an advisor in the DfE about that, and they just need to report that back to the local public health team. I think that is a big ask of school leaders to do that. I think they're making very significant public health decisions there, not just in relation to their school, but obviously into the communities that they serve, and also to the ability of parents to get to work. So I've taken that up with the DfE, and I do hope that we get a constructive response back from the DfE about that. At the moment, in terms of incidents in schools, there are some schools that have had no incidences at all. There are other schools that have had incidences of coronavirus in their schools and settings. The overwhelming majority of those are actually from community and home settings, where those people then come into school rather than in-school transmission between people who are in the school. We provide a lot of support around school food, and in particular, schools actually starting to support each other where they have issues or staff shortages in terms of their kitchen staff as well. Children with EHCPs were entitled to attend school during the lockdown, and we continue to focus on that particular group to ensure that the support and the provision that they need is as continuous as possible throughout this. Transport has resumed in September, and some school colleagues have helped us with that. To begin with, our school transport system was designated as being part of the public transport system, but actually through working with the Department for Transport, we've been able to get that redesignated so that school transport was able to resume in September. Attendance during the lockdown itself was about 20 to 25% of children still coming to school throughout the lockdown. Since September, attendance rates are approximately about 87 to 80% in primary schools and about 85% in secondary schools. There is still a lot of anxiety amongst parents in relation to the safety measures that have been put in place by schools. Schools have all been supported by our health and safety team in Sheffield, regardless of whether they are maintained or not, and a risk assessment has been issued to try and mitigate any risks. Nevertheless, our own campaigns continue in order to try and reassure parents about the safety and well-being of their children in school, but that clearly is also still driving attendance figures as well. We included some data in the pack about elective home education, and there has been a significant rise in the number of children who are electively home educated since September. We normally see about 20 new children going on to the elective home education register in September, and we're now somewhere at about 200, which is a significant rise. For most of those children, their parents cite anxiety and concerns about coronavirus as being the reason for wanting to educate their children at home. We have had incidences where children have had to go home because of incidents in their school of the coronavirus. Work has been provided by schools when they are at home. Before the summer, there was a laptop scheme where about 1,800 laptops were provided by the DFE to vulnerable children. Since then, there's a new laptop scheme, which is not without its problems in the DFE in terms of trying to get schools to access that. And shortly, I'll just ask Stephen to give some detail on this, but Learn Sheffield have also been working in terms of a private initiative in terms of donations of laptops as well for children, young people to use at home. The government announced about £1 billion of catch-up funding for schools, and this is basically about 350,000 to provide a national tutoring service and about 650 million to go directly to schools for them to provide individual support for children. Schools are just starting to get their allocations, and again, it would be good for Stephen just to update on this, but Learn Sheffield colleagues are working closely with schools to try and make sure that we actually get the most out of that funding when it is allocated. And then Learn Sheffield colleagues have also led a COVID recovery festival, and I'm just going to bring Stephen in now, Chair, just to talk about the catch-up programme, but also the recovery festival as well.
Thank you, Andrew. So the festival ran across September. It was just over 20 events, as you'll have seen in the slides. Just over 1,000 people, actually, which is more than it said on the slides, have now accessed those sessions, either live or by watching the recordings later. And that feeds into now the work that we're doing, which we'll publish next week, having worked with various colleagues within the council and across the sector into a COVID recovery plan. That will include, as Andrew intimated, support for schools in how to make the most of and use the catch-up funding, which will be available. And the other thing Andrew referred to there was a private laptop scheme, which has been promoted by Councillor Mohammed and also Dave Richards, the Chief Executive of One Disco, which is an appeal to businesses to donate laptops that can then be reallocated to school. That's only just starting. We've had the first sort of 2 or 3 donations, and Learn Sheffield will take those laptops and distribute them. So perhaps that's something to report back on at a later date. Thank you, Andrew.
So really that's it from me, Chair. Tried to keep it short and sweet as you requested, but obviously happy to answer any questions as far as possible.
Thank you for that. I mean, I had assumed that people had read the paperwork, and given that most people in one way or another are involved quite heavily in the education system, I'm convinced you're going to get some questions. Aptisam, would you like to add anything to what's just been said?
Not at this stage, Chair. I might come in later on as members have questions.
Okie doke, thank you. Now I'm going to ask I'm going to start with Sasha. If you would like to make your contribution, you don't have to. You can sort of just sit there and wait or whatever. All right.
Can I just say thank you on behalf of Heads? It's been a challenging time, an unprecedented time, and the support from Learn Sheffield, from Public Health in terms of the risk assessments, and in terms of Andrew for his daily, if not briefings, if not 3 times a day briefings as things changed, has been invaluable in moving forward. Public Health have been absolutely fantastic. Obviously working in the special sector, some of the guidance that has been issued has not necessarily been specific to the students that we work with, or necessarily understanding of the complexities of the students in terms of their medical needs and their social and emotional needs. So it's been really wonderful to have somebody that we can refer to in terms of some of the medical side in getting our students back to school. I think it's really positive at the moment. We've only had a small number of students who have struggled to come back to Bent Green, And again, we've been offered support in encouraging those pupils and reassuring those parents to come back, and we're now back at full complement, which is wonderful. Our students are happy to be back. I think they've definitely missed school, and it's lovely to see them. And I think we're just going to continue to go through the guidance. I think there is some work around how we can support students with significant medical issues to get back to school, and I think there is work looking at that, and that's an area that we need to kind of progress with. But in terms of how we've moved through this time, like I said, I would just like to thank colleagues for supporting us in that.
Thank you. Joanne?
Hello, I'm just crossing things off my list that I don't want to repeat that Sasha's already said. Yeah, it has been unprecedented and challenging times, no matter what sector you're working in, particularly education, I think. And I'm glad that Andrew pointed out that we didn't have a full school closure on the 23rd of March, that schools did remain open and did play a valuable part during the actual national lockdown. I would just like to reiterate that people may comment that the education sector has become fragmented somewhat over the years with the introduction of multi-academy trusts, federations and other arrangements. However, in Sheffield, I think what's been proven during these very challenging circumstances is that we've come together as a city with a citywide strategy, really led despite whatever status your school might be in. So I would like to not only name public health as a big support to us, but actually name Bethan Plant and Gregfell as offering advice 24/7 throughout the pandemic to us as leaders, so that we have never felt alone in this, and we've had someone to help us decipher national guidance when it hasn't been the best. I'd also
Thank you.
like to
sorry to interrupt. We'll make sure that that gets minuted somewhere. Thank you.
Okay. Also like to obviously pay tribute to Andrew and Stephen and all their colleagues. Andrew's played a valuable role in again deciphering, and his regular updates and being there on the telephone and email also being invaluable. We've dealt with a lot, and we've still got a lot to deal with. Children are returning to school, which is great and what we want to see. I think there's still a lot of anxiety, and there's a lot of work to do around mental health and well-being of pupils, parents and staff, and that's going to be ongoing in a big strand of our work moving forward. I think also a need to talk about the schools that I work with are in areas of disadvantage, and food distribution and making sure that families are fed has been a key part of our work moving forward. And again, ably supported by the council. The Easter hamper scheme was particularly well received and brought us all together to deliver hampers to children and families. I think also the way that we've worked with the voluntary food distribution sector as well, fair share, junk food, or lots of different services, to where we now regularly doorstep deliver food parcels to families where needed, has been a key area of our work. The National Free School Meals Vouchers, yeah, it served a purpose. It was a very difficult scheme to manage in the first instance, and also for some of our parents found it difficult to access as well, but we did get there in the end. Learning at home, I think we've moved forward as an education sector in a few months, what may have taken us years to move forward with how we can now offer online learning to our families at home. I think though we need to remember that some of our children talk about access to laptops and devices, but for some of our families we were delivering desks and chairs, and pencils, paper, reading books. There was no point in our libraries at school being full of books when children didn't have books at home. So it's not just about the online learning. there are other things that children need at home to be able to learn. And I'm sure other people have got lots to say, but again, would just like to pass my thanks on that we were able to pull together as a city education sector, and that we will continue to do that because these challenges are not over yet. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Kathy.
Hi, from Dogcroft. I would echo what Joanna just said about the feeling terribly supported. I know from my colleagues across the city that both from Learn Sheffield and from Andrew and from Public Health, no questions too small. The reality is there's an avalanche of things that appeared from the DFE, you know, several times a day often, and not always aligned with common sense, it's true to say, and certainly not in the practicalities. You know, with a sandpit, I mean, the latest risk assessment that's due to come out, it will give specifics about you standing one side rather than the other. And it's those nitty gritty things which you as a leader, you feel terribly responsible for, because ultimately my decisions might actually result in somebody's death, you know, families and my staff. And it's a big responsibility. And I am not an epidemiologist, can't even say the word, but that's not my forte. Education's what my speciality is. So being able to lean on people like Public Health, who that is their speciality, has been really, really useful, and no question is sort of been turned away. And I'm also involved with weekly discussions with Andrew as part of my sort of union representative, and I know that all the unions have pulled together and really been trying to both represent their members, but also to get to grips with the nitty gritties that are involved in what is a very, very complex situation, and getting the balance right, not just for the children and their families, but also of all the staff working within schools. It's been a tricky time. I'm in my 21st year as a head teacher, and I can honestly say that I've never had to work so hard in my life. But what I think you can't underestimate schools having to do, and particularly the leadership, is how much the day-to-day management stuff you're dealing with rather than the leadership. You know, I'm probably the most expensive wonderful dinner lady sort of at the moment, having to deliver when you can't get around, and because of the structures you're having to work within schools in order to keep everybody safe in terms of the bubble structure, everyone's having to chip in and do things which actually don't come under your role, which makes things really complex. So then when you're reading about obviously catch up and recovery and all that, which absolutely schools are thinking about, you have to lay that in the context of still, although it is a new normal, it isn't normal, and therefore you're having to work within all the structures that we as a school have had to set up. And yes, we've had a wonderful risk assessment, it's been great, but each site has had to look at your own sort of both physical premises situation, but also staffing, and tweak it every day. I have to say staffing is an issue just because tests are not quick back. It sometimes can take 4 to 5 days, and you know, my biggest dread in the morning is when my phone goes off and somebody's has been in contact with somebody who's positive, whatever, and you're just willing them to come back, and it's trickier because you whereas in an unusual situation you might do teaming ladling with staff, you can't do because you can't burst your bubbles, which I have to say is interesting times, shall we say. As a school, obviously, so the school I represent is in an area of affluence. However, there's still been sort of families have had their own struggles, particularly sort of when you're trying to, I know when they've been trying to support their young people at home, you know, when they're also trying their own jobs often, and it's not an easy, you as a school might provide things, that doesn't necessarily mean, even if you do have a computer and facilities at home, that actually you can manage that. You might have young children at home managing, and or as well as obviously two adults who may or may not be sort of working in the house. So parents are feeding back. It's tricky. However, good the resources that we're giving them. I would echo what Joanne said about the sector working together, and that is a wonderful, you know, whether you're maintained, which we currently are, and I know that in Sheffield many schools are within the academy setting. Actually, that hasn't mattered in terms of the support that we've received, and that is a wonderful thing about hopefully going forward. It's a very positive step that we can do so. it's been difficult at times that some of the national media has not always been supportive of education, and that's difficult when you're trying to keep morale of everybody, because people are also dealing with their own personal lives, and this has affected people in lots of different ways. Not necessarily if somebody's been affected by COVID itself, but obviously it might be you can't see your own family, those kind of things. And life within education is tricky as enough, never mind this top layer of all the other things. So what I would say is that feeling you're part of a collective rather than on your own has enabled us to all sort of work together and not feel you're alone, which has been great. That's all I want to say.
Thank you very much. Chris French, please.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm glad I went last because I was trying to sort of get the feel where the room was. It's been a really unusual period from March. Schools have had to work exceedingly hard. We've all become expert in safety planning and logistics and goodness knows what. Cities pulled together. There's been some fantastic leadership and support from the centre and from public health. When I look at my 6 schools, senior staff and staff have been amazing, really. But also I'm quite positive, actually, not about actually schools are returned. If we're thinking about the return to school, we put a huge amount of effort into our safety and logistical planning, but children have, on the whole, returned really strongly. Parental confidence in the overwhelming majority of cases has been really positive. What we planned and thought would happen has. And actually, I've been surprised at how quickly we've got back to some form of normality. But the challenges are emerging, though, they're quite clear. One is about the increasing absence. In all of my schools have been affected by COVID cases. So community infection brought into school, not the school itself. Or 2 schools in the second week back, so within days. I've had 3 head teachers all been pulled off through contact tracing and 2 deputies. I've had in other schools significant members of staff out in my central support team. Got a primary school where the dinner and dining room team were taken away, and quite a few staff. So in terms of the impact on schools, it's been quite variable. So I've got 2 schools where it's about 8.5% of students have been excoded, which means they're off school because of COVID, and one where that's around 2%, but still above the city average. So the challenges at the moment are how that impact on staff absence and pupil absence starts to undermine the neat start that you're trying to put into place. So staff absence, we've got about 500 staff across the trust. We've been running on about 80 to 90 staff absent in the last 2 or 3 weeks across the schools. That's quite high. In terms of student numbers, again, quite high. And it's 1 or 2 schools, particularly larger secondary schools, that got quite close to a point where with staff absent, we were beginning to consider whether we can continue to fully run. But we have done, and we're keeping that going. But the implications of that are that senior staff in particularly around the way schools have to be organised in terms of zoning and separating starts and ends and lunch times, means that there's a lot of pressure, particularly on senior staff, to make sure that they're highly present and often on duty for large parts of the day. The positives are that actually in terms of student wellbeing, behaviour statistics are all positive in our 6 schools. So actually the high profile of staff, kids' willingness to get back into school has actually had a really positive impact. The problem is, though, in terms of pupil absence, when bubbles go off, it's relatively easy to manage because the staff tend to go off with a year group or a group. But when you've got children rolling off and rolling on who are linked to contact tracing either in school or at home, setting work that's appropriate and within the sequence of learning is more challenging. And so our remote education offer, which I agree with colleagues, is a combination of virtual but also hard copy resources, it is more of a challenge. And that's something I've been spending my time and our team on quite a lot to make sure that we can meet that demand. So moving forward, I see more staff absence. I see more kids being off school. and the expectations around remote learning really needing to kick in. I see some anxieties, particularly around older students. When you're in Y13 and you've been off for 4 weeks out of 6 already, and you want to get to that university or that apprenticeship, that's a concern. Or if you're in Y6 or whatever. So concern about fraying at the edges, keeping the wheels on the wagon, I guess. Sustaining this level of effort throughout the year, although I'm confident we can do, but it is demanding. And I think managing some of the things that we simply don't know around the corner. For example, we didn't know 3 months ago that we'd be investing about £200,000 in outdoor covered areas because the dining rooms can't cope with the number of students that we're attempting to put them through, or that a dining room in one of my schools needs to have significant investment because we've had to split the dining places from 1 to 2. So those ongoing costs. But it's been hard, it's challenging on heads and staff. Schools are back though and feel amazingly settled, but when you get a disruption, it can be quite profound. And the direction of travel looks like there's more disruption and more fraying of the edges and more absence to come, which will rely on schools being even more resilient and our remote learning offer being really robust and profound. And nobody's telling us anything about end of year outcomes. Nobody's talking about primary schools at all. And secondary, very little clarity around Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, apart from that they're going back a little bit later. But there are some positives as well. And there are a number of things that we have done in secondary schools and primary schools that have been driven by safety expectations that we won't unpack when we come back post-COVID. Which have actually had quite a profound effect on student behaviour or supervision or just general well-being in school. We haven't been massively hit with issues around well-being. Well, what we say is that the children that we knew about, who we were concerned about before lockdown, we've still got those children, and we don't have a lot of others that we are necessarily picking up, although it is very early days. And we're aware that actually the evidence suggests that those kids will probably pop up a little bit later. But on the whole, kids are happy to be back. So are staff, so are parents. And we'd rather that it doesn't get worse, which it looks like it will do. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. I have a series of questions now. So I'm going to take them. I'll do them one at a time. I think that's probably the best way. I think, Sam, you're the first, I believe.
I don't think I was on. I think I was on personal interests. So I don't think I've asked to speak. Yeah, can I speak on item 4? That was about personal interests.
It was about that, was it? Okay, thank you. Julie Grocott.
Thank you, Chair. I've got quite a few questions. I'll just lump them all together, if that's okay. First of all, I would like to say thank you to the teaching staff for coming this afternoon. That's been really helpful and incredibly useful. And I think following the lockdown, you know, we all have a greater appreciation of the fantastic work that you do. Having got up on a Monday morning and looked at the school timetable and realised that home learning was maths, I can tell you I was not very impressed at all. So you really do have my gratitude for the work you do, and I think parents everywhere will now be appreciating the difficult challenges that go with teaching. So I think just from that point alone, we've all learned some things, and that's been very helpful. My questions are around a number of issues. The figures that Andrew mentioned in his presentation about attendance at schools being 87% Asia primary and 85% at secondary, it's about concerns about the children who aren't attending. Are those children that we already know and recognise have got additional needs or care or support or something? Is that something we need to be concerned about, the children who are not attending school, and that not only are they not getting their education but not receiving other support that should be there? Which then goes on to the children, the 200 children who are now being elected to be home educated. You've said that that's a significant rise. My concern is, how are we as a council managing that? Have we got the staff to make sure that those children who are being uneducated are receiving the proper education and support, not only for themselves, but for the parents or carers who are providing that education? My big thing, it'll be no surprise for any of you that I'm going to mention mental health. And I would really like to hear from the teaching staff that we've got with us today, their views about what is happening with mental health in the school settings. I know you've already touched on that, but in terms of, is the support that's been offered, is it enough? Is it being given in a timely manner? And is there anything that you think that we should be doing that we aren't doing to improve the mental health services that we are giving to our children? And then one around food banks. I know Joanne particularly mentioned the difficulties about feeding children. Are we making sure that all parents are aware of where local food banks are, how they can access local food banks, and encouraging people to use them? Because I think, you know, it's really important that we've got our children and families fed. So we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to make sure that people know and understand where the food banks are, how to contact them, how to use them. And then just finally picking up on the point that Chris raised in relation to what's coming, and talking about knowing that we're going to be getting more staff absences, knowing that we need to be doing more remote learning. What planning and preparation are we doing in place so that when we get to that point, it's not suddenly a surprise and we're left wondering how we're going to deal with all of that? So I do appreciate that's a lot, but it is a really big subject and I am sorry about that.
Could I just use Chair's prerogative and interject? One of the things that maybe I'm wrong, but I thought you were actually quite gentle on the advice that you've been given by government, and didn't really make a lot of comment as to whether it made any sense or not. I don't know whether that was because you were being diplomatic or you were fearful of repercussions or whatever, but you know, if you feel, if I've got that right, and you feel free enough and confident enough to tell me what you think about the advice you've been given, I'd really like to hear that. Thank you.
And I'd express a view. It was, I mean, it was difficult, wasn't it? Because we'd sometimes have a snippet of an announcement, and then a little bit more, and then a press conference, and then the final guidance might come out 5 days later. So trying to keep ahead of that and trying to keep that coherent was a challenge. But in many ways, I mean, it was a frustration. But I mean, as a trust, we created a sort of master list and linked into the local authority risk assessment, and then managed it. So it was an irritation, and it wasn't appropriate. But I think we just got on with things actually, and tried to make sure that things were as they should be. But yeah, it was an irritant, certainly. It wasn't good enough.
If
I can just jump in there as well. I think schools were often finding out, watching the television to find out what was happening next with the next announcement. So as it was being announced on the television, that's when we were finding out as leaders. But I think because we were all working together, and because in education, there is the feeling of you need to get on with it because it's for the benefit of the children, that we knew by the next day we'd be deciphering it together, we'd be working it out together. But it is a load to carry, I would say, and that in deciphering that and making sense of it, and when you've led staff so far down one path. So before the summer, we were in bubbles of 15. And then in very short notice before we came back, after the summer, we were suddenly in classes of 30 and had to move really, really quickly to that. You almost feel as a leader that you're letting your staff down by not giving them the messages when they're looking to you. And you can't stand there and say, but I've only just found this out. So it is a load to carry as a leader, and the messages haven't always been great, how they've come nationally, but we understand that it's a response to an unprecedented situation. I think my fallback position has always been that I knew the next day there would be a team in Sheffield working closely on it to help me decipher it so that I could then lead my staff appropriately.
Can I just put from a special school perspective, I think the guidance was written very primarily for primary and secondary schools. I think a lot of it was generic, and I think there was a lack of appreciation for some of the complexities of our students, particularly around some of the guidance around public health and looking at hygiene practices for students who cannot socially distance, for students who do require intimate care, for students who do require tracheotomy changes and things like that. And I think that was a great difficulty for us to be able to navigate through that. And I think, all credit to public health for supporting us in that. But often, even the guidance around public health and transport, or when the department said that, we can go on to transport, they didn't account for the fact that all of our children come through special needs transport, and the complexities of being able to actually accommodate those students who struggle to socially distance, who don't wear masks on transport. So again, we've had to interpret that, and we've had to go back to colleagues within Sheffield to be able to interpret the guidance that's come out. And we have felt supported in that, and I absolutely agree with Joanne. We have come together as a collective, but it has been particularly challenging to be able to reassure staff who have perhaps had their own health needs or are caring for somebody, that what you are putting in place is going to protect them moving forward. And I think obviously with the increase at the moment and the fact that we're going into, we're in a high area, that is very much forefront on their minds, because a lot of them are caring for people who are medically vulnerable, and they want that reassurance, and that's very difficult to provide because the guidance hasn't been specific enough.
And if I could just say that you asked an honest answer, the reality is that the guidance has often been contradictory, and it's certainly been often far too late. Part of my role as a leader is I'm often planning ahead and project management, and there doesn't seem to be an awful lot of that that's come out. I mean, how you can say that you want to support schools with the mental health of their staff and then produce that to actually come out at 12 o'clock on a Saturday and a bank holiday weekend shows actually a complete lack of insensitivity, never mind of common sense, that actually if you want to do something on mental well-being of staff, you do not produce it then. And it's been very frustrating. And I think it's almost at the moment, if I'm honest, that you've got the guidance for the general public, and obviously I quite understand about tier system, and then you've got the guidance for schools, and actually the two don't necessarily link in. So you've got staff and children and their parents who can't perhaps go and see their granny down the road, but yes, you can get in a class with 30 children because that's safe, isn't it? That is the reality, is that the two lots of guidance, both for generally and then within schools, they're not tying up. You asked Councillor about one of the things to highlight. One of the issues there is obviously with a lot of things shutting down with the lockdown earlier, things like waiting lists now to access services such as Reigate. I mean, one of my families this week who was waiting for an ASD assessment has been told that there's about 1,000 people in front of them. That's a long wait when you've got families that are going through a certain amount of vulnerability, and I'm not quite sure how, in a sense, that can be quickened up in any way, but certainly that is stressful for those families that are waiting to access some of the services that would bring. In terms of remote learning, you asked, all schools are very aware of now a legal requirement by the 22nd of October. How kind of the government to give us that as a legal requirement when we've actually been working our socks off since March. But every school in Sheffield will be thinking about remote learning, but it's not as easy to think. I'm of an infant school and we've got young children now. Actually sitting in front of a screen all day is actually not what you would want for a 4-year-old. So actually it's how you interpret it, so that you've got the age appropriate facilities and activities you would want children to do, but in a way that parents can also manage, while, as I have already mentioned, they might be trying to hold down their jobs and look after other children at the same time. So it's not as easy as just saying it, but all schools, I can tell you, are considering that and are in a different position perhaps now than they were in emergency footing in March, when we suddenly had to we had a day's notice before we went into that.
Thank you. Julie, did you, I'm sorry to have interrupted your questioning session. Did you get most of them answered, or there is still some outstanding?
I think I'd like, I'm really concerned about the number in terms of Reigate, and I think that's something we do need to pick up and look at. I'd just like some reassurance really around food banks, and also I don't know if Andrew would be able to just tell us something about what's happening and the support we're able to provide in relation to home educated children. I think they're probably more points for him than the teaching staff. Thank you, Chair.
So, Councillor Gregg, you asked about attendance and elective home education. On both of those, they are significant areas of concern and focus for us in the council. What we've taken is a view that actually what's behind attendance is, as I explained, is about understandable anxieties on the part of parents about their children, and you don't necessarily provide reassurance by taking a punitive approach. So a decision we've taken in the council is that at least this term we won't be pursuing punitive attendance fines with children and with families, and what we want to do is actually to work with families to better understand what's behind their anxieties and to try and to provide some reassurance for them. The council had its own back to school campaign over the summer holiday, and the government also had its own back to school campaign over the summer holiday. I can't say for any certainty what was in the government press releases on that, but what I can say is that the media reported that as, you know, you need to get back to school in September or else you will be fined. And I'm reasonably convinced that's actually what has driven many of the cases of elective home education, because despite our best efforts to reassure people that in Sheffield we won't be fining people, at least for the foreseeable future, nevertheless, that is one of the things that parents have been saying to us, which is that, well, we're worried that if we don't actually bring our children into school, we're just going to be fined anyway. In relation to the support that we put in on both those strands, so in terms of attendance, our attendance officers who would normally be pursuing prosecutions or whatever have been reallocated in terms of actually providing support and contact to families in order to try and understand, as I say, the anxieties that are there and to try and to provide some reassurance and solutions to that. In terms of elective home education, there's two areas where families, where checks and balances are putting around that. One is in relation to our multi-agency support team, MAST, who provide safe and well checks for any children who are who commence being electively home educated. Now, what's happened there is within the MAST team is actually that as an activity is being reassigned as a priority. So it's not that we haven't added additional capacity into that, but we certainly made sure that that is an absolute priority for those teams. The other part of the check then is around, which is what your question was, which is really around the provision itself and what plans families have to support their children. We have one teacher in Sheffield for that. The committee's previously met her and she's presented to the committee on a previous occasion, the last time about a year ago. And clearly one teacher is not adequate to actually provide that support to 200 new cases. So what we've done is we've allocated teachers from our SEND team and also from our lifelong learning team as well, who have a breadth of experience across special needs and also different ages. We've also put in some additional business support around that as well in order to process the applications more quickly so that we're getting on top of that. The numbers do seem to have petered off slightly in the last week or so. I'm hoping that we've reached a peak. In Sheffield, there is a protocol that's agreed with all our schools and academies that any child who becomes electively home educated can return to their school within the first 12 weeks of being electively home educated. The next week, I think it's the census in schools, and one of the things I am worried about is children who are not on roll because they're electively home educated. That actually means that resource, the funding to their school, will disappear next year when those budgets are issued to them. It also means that our own council budget would be reduced as part of that. And it's not the cash I'm bothered about. What I'm bothered about is actually the resource that obviously goes with that in order to support those children if and when their parents choose to return them back to a school setting. And obviously in relation to children who are attending an oversubscribed school, if, for example, they continue to be electively home educated past that 12-week protocol, it would probably be quite difficult for them to get back into the schools that they've actually left in order to become electively home educated. So we're actually making these positions known to the government, because I do believe that both in terms of funding and also in terms of the kind of like one-way street that is that's there around admissions, we think that the government needs to perhaps consider some sort of legislation around that in order to alleviate any problems that might arise from that.
Okay, Julie.
Yeah, that's been really helpful. Thank you.
Francine.
Hello, thank you. I know you mentioned end of year outcomes, Chris, when you spoke, and I just wanted to ask about exams. I know exams cause children and teachers a lot of stress at the best of times, and the current uncertainty and just total lack of planning from this government is putting unmanageable pressure on teachers and causing children and families a lot of anxiety as well. I think, you know, we know that the summer exams crisis showed that, you know, the government needs to do some serious scenario planning for exams 2021, and that business as usual exams just aren't an option. But, you know, so far there doesn't seem to be any serious planning on this issue, does there? I know they've floated the possibility of delaying exams by a few weeks, but I think, you know, everyone's aware that that is just not a proportionate response to the scale of this crisis. I know the NEU's spoken about, you know, various things, the need for like more optionality within exams and also for ongoing assessment throughout the year, so that there is something to fall back on if children aren't able to attend exams. I was just wondering, like, what conversations is the council having with the Department for Education about this potential crisis? Thanks.
We have weekly, sometimes twice weekly, sometimes daily conversations with the DFE, Councillor Johnson, and clearly in relation to the exams scenario, it's less than satisfactory. So we've got some secondary schools in the city where they haven't yet been affected by any incidences of coronavirus. We've got some in the city where they've had repeated, unconnected, but repeated incidences. One secondary school in the city where its year 11 students have been at home for about 4 out of the last 5 weeks. And when you link that then to the apparent decision to allow head teachers then to make decisions separate to the DFE helpline and Public Health England in terms of who goes home and who doesn't go home, then really what you're building up there is a variation within the city in terms of provision, a variation across the region, and obviously a variation across the country. So we are having conversations with the DFE, and we'll continue to press the case that we're not clear about how the exams and the standardised assessments that take place or due to take place next summer will necessarily be equitable given that pattern that seems to have emerged. So we continue to do that, and I'd be happy, Chair, to report the outcomes of those conversations back to the committee when they're concluded.
Can I
add? Francine?
Sorry,
could I just say something? I mean, I just well, is there a common? Colleagues have spoken about sort of unanimity and a united front and cooperation. Is there a consensus on what form exams should take next year? Because I'll give you my personal opinion for what it's worth. I think somebody should take a decision now and say we will have continuous assessment and children judged by their teachers, not for an exam that might take place under some bizarre stop-start situation that we've got now. So that's where I am. But my question is there a consensus amongst the schools in the city, and therefore the message that you're giving to the education department?
Just going to ask Stephen to respond in terms of the view across the sector.
I think there is a fair degree of unanimity. I think it's still fluid. You know, there's still discussion. Obviously, Scotland came out quite recently with a much clearer steer for their schools about what their end of year would look like. And the issue, as Andrew says, is entirely about equity in terms of at the end of the year. I think different forms of assessment are likely to be where we end up, if I'm honest, but it is unhelpful that the government aren't making a decision quickly. But it is an emerging thing, and I think it's, you know, people are different ideas are being pitched into the mix as we go along. But I would say there is a fair degree of unanimity. The other thing I would say is Sheffield schools have been working with a campaign nationally called Worthless, or Worthless, I should say, rather than Worthless, who were campaigning around school funding over the past couple of years, but have broadened their voice to pick up some of these issues as well.
Right. Okay. Francine, have you finished?
Yeah, thank you. That was really useful. It's a really good point as well that you made about the fact that heads have been told to make their own decisions, and that this could have a huge impact on things like exams as well, and just cause inbuilt inequality. Thanks.
Yeah. Cliff.
Thank you, Chair. Apologies, I had to nip out early on because someone knocked at the door, so I missed a little bit of what Andrew was saying. But I've got a couple of questions I'd like to ask now. The first is about school transport. I understand children are staying within bubbles within their school, but what happens when they get on the bus to and from school? That's the first question. And the second question is concerning the laptop scheme. Can I ask what's being done about providing broadband access, or do these laptops work in a standalone kind of way? Thank you.
So on transport, both in relation to transport for special schools and actually broader transport, what you've alluded to there is not an insignificant issue. So at one point, Sasha, I'm sure will want to add in terms of SEN transport. Clearly, going to a special school, for example, the children don't necessarily come from a single geographical area. So children might have been working in one particular bubble and construction within their school, but actually then picked up in a completely different bubble. And I know that Transport Services have tried their best to iron that out. I don't know if that's been successful, Sasha, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, unfortunately, just because of the logistics and because of the cost, in order to actually accommodate the bubbles we have within schools, that can't be replicated in Sheffield Transport. They are doing everything they possibly can, and we have worked with them. We've worked with them about trying to support our students in some visual support, and they have been very proactive in doing that. Transport staff do wear masks. Obviously, they can't socially distance on the bus, but we've worked together to look at staggered start and finish times. You know, it does prove an issue for us. But it's something that I think is replicated in mainstream schools as well, in terms of bubbles being in a school and you're trying to protect and do everything that you possibly can, and as soon as a child goes onto transport, that bubble breaks. I think in secondaries it's better, obviously, because if they are on public transport they will wear masks, but for our students they are exempt from wearing masks, although they are encouraged, and we are trying to encourage that because we see that's an important life skill for our students to learn. We don't know how long we're going to have COVID for, so being able to wear a mask, if they can tolerate that, is something that will allow them to be able to go into shops and go on buses, which is again is very important for their adult life. But yes, it is an issue.
And in relation to transport for mainstream schools, I mean, clearly there is the facility for children to sit in zones and in bubbles on the transport. But if I just make a slightly broader point, include transport, which is that head teachers and schools are obviously incredibly busy and able to actually influence what happens inside their schools. But in relation to, you know, parents at the gate or children who get onto transport. In reality, once they're out of sight of staff within school, it's harder to actually regulate or to enforce the bubbles or the social distancing as part of that.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have just in terms of buses, I think the city moved heaven and earth to get the capacity back to what it was required. But any notion of bubbles, maintenance of bubbles and social distancing effectively goes out the window for those children that come by bus. And actually, I think in our PHE conversations, they're not always keyed into that, because it's almost impossible to do the contact tracing because of the changes that happen every day. So yeah, it's a kink in the system, which it certainly isn't refined enough. But the capacity to have separate bubbles, say in a large secondary, you'd probably be doubling or trebling the number of buses, all coming at 2 minutes intervals to meet the needs of children, which just hasn't been possible. I don't know actually whether there's been any significant health evidence around contamination on buses. Actually, I don't think there necessarily has been, but at the moment the bubbles don't, we can zone, but they don't maintain the bubbles, so they mix.
Okay, Cliff, do you feel as though your questions have been answered?
Well, I think the first question's been answered. What about broadband for laptop, please?
Sorry, I forgot that. So the laptop scheme that the DFE have run, they use, dare I say, in this meeting, they use an algorithm to actually determine the levels of laptops that are allocated to individual schools. And as part of that algorithm, they also then determine the likelihood of broadband connectivity within homes, and the two numbers don't necessarily match. But the short answer is that some of the laptops do come with a Wi-Fi dongle to enable connectivity at home, and some don't, and it's prescribed by an algorithm from the DFE.
Who pays for it? Who pays for the running costs?
The DFE.
Oh, okay.
And so if a home doesn't have broadband, is that tough, or will they provide, say, a 5G or a 4G dongle?
Some do, and I mean, I can bring in other colleagues working in schools, but Chris, Joanne, in both their trusts, they've been very proactive in terms of actually buying from their own resources, laptops and devices to provide to children, just actually on the assumption that the DFE scheme itself isn't comprehensive enough. I noticed that Councillor Rivers also asked a question earlier about laptops and how they're allocated. So the 1,800 that we were allocated in the summer, about 1,700 of those were based on whether a child had a social worker allocated to them. About 150 were for Year 11 students based upon whether or not they were eligible for free school meals. And within that, the algorithm played out in terms of whether some of those had dongles or not. And then since September, it's for all year groups above, for Year 3 and above. And again, it's principally based upon eligibility for free school meals, but with a combination of the school also asking directly families whether or not they have a level of kit. But in all of that complexity, this is where colleagues like Joanne and Chris have put their corporate hands in their pockets and actually bought the devices. John, do you want to talk about your scheme?
Yeah, we've looked at this in all ways as to what the barriers are to remote learning, and we found in our trust, which is 6 primary schools in the southeast of the city, that it's access to devices rather than access to Wi-Fi that causes the most issues, because in most households there may be one device which is a phone, like a smartphone or whatever the right term is. I'm not very technologically minded. And they're sharing that between the family. For the older siblings, the younger siblings, it's actually mum's phone or somebody else in the house's phone. So actually supplying devices. So in our school, we're buying tablets on a managed system for some year groups to be able to use a tablet in school and at home to promote home learning. And we've done that as a trust. the amount of devices that we've actually got in through the government scheme, even though in our trust we're 50% plus free school meals across the trust, some schools considerably higher, have been really minimum in number. And you can't access them until you have a bubble closure. They're not actually delivered until halfway through your bubble closure. But as time goes on, we will build up in each school a set of laptops that when a bubble closes, they can go home. And the Wi-Fi access that's been provided to us through the DFE has been BT Wi-Fi codes that work well in some areas of the city, but not in others. So we're again having to purchase dongles and cards so that people can have access where they haven't, but that's not been as much as we thought it would when we've done our own audits.
Yeah, I'm pleased to hear about that.
I mean, I'd add that we purchased about 120 Chromebooks from our own resources. We did, the DFE numbers came through in the summer, although they were too late. Effectively, they arrived towards the end of the summer, and that's why we purchased, because we also put out about 150 additional laptops that were within schools. So we actually pushed out nearly 300 of our own from our own resources, and then they were complemented by the DFE chunk that came in a little bit later. The new system, and I agree with Joanne that it's really connectivity. It's usually devices, and actually we've still got the dongles that we were allocated because parents simply didn't want them or couldn't find use for them. The new DFE scheme is interesting, is that if you get past a particular threshold of students absent on a day and you tick the bottom of the return form, which took us a week or two to realise that we needed to do it, then you get the identified laptops. So we've got 230 at the moment been delivered in the autumn term, and I know King Egbert's is entitled to another 76 because of it. That reflects the number of kids that we've had off, incidentally. The issue then is, I mean, the priority at the moment is to make sure that our lists of students that don't have appropriate devices is fully up to date, which it is. And then we're training children whilst they're in school to access some of the remote resources. But I think the other thing is that the access to devices isn't necessarily the full answer to remote learning or remote education. A number of our schools, majority of stuff that goes home is also supported by hard copy booklets, physical resources, as well as access to the virtual learning platforms that we've got. But we've found it better than it was in the summer and fairly rapid.
Say for special needs, obviously, there's a lot of compartmentalisation around school and home. We've just done a survey with parents, and 75% of parents have said they would prefer hard copy rather than a computer, because some of our students see computers as a very specific enjoyment factor and a reward rather than actually to be able to do work. So I think, it is about a blended offer is what I would consider, and an acknowledgement that for some students, so it's more the life skills that they're developing at home, because the pressure that we have to put on some of our parents to be able to manage that. And I think that's something we've got to consider. If you're an independent child and you can work on a laptop, that's one thing. But if you're a parent and you're supporting 3 children with special needs, and you're trying to educate at home, that puts an enormous amount of pressure on a family. So I think, it's looking at all of those different factors and making sure that the provision is appropriate for the child and for the family situation.
Okay, Cliff.
Okay, yes, thanks, Chair.
Alison Warner, please.
Right, I've a couple of things really in terms of pressures on staff. I mean, there was a point this week where I thought soon we're going to get to the point where the number of children in school outnumbered the staff that were available. We have had a number of issues around the people that you really, or services that you really want in school, like the ed psychs or the social workers, and they're not coming into school. And they're also had issues around whether you're getting hot meals or not. Now, in some schools, actually, a child having a hot meal at lunchtime is actually very important when they are not necessarily getting that at home. And, you know, I realise that the school meal service is having problems in terms of their staffing, but actually there ought to be the opportunity for the children, at least on many days of the week, to have a hot meal. And I think that's more important now we're moving into October, November, December. And there you also have the other tension, which is other people almost like insisting wanting to come into school, and are naming this Ofsted, and now the HSE have suddenly decided that they want to come into schools and do inspections. And so all of those kind of things actually put additional pressures on the school. And, you know, the number of head teachers or teachers who've said to me, I'm nearly on my knees, are, you know, legion. I know there's been phenomenal support for schools. Some of it, notably the DfE, has been very contradictory or late, but nevertheless, just keeping the show on the road at the moment is a phenomenal pressure, and you can do without having to argue about a hot meal for the kids or the HSE coming in or Ofsted coming in or whatever. And I wondered how far your discussions, Andrew, with the DfE have gone as far as the discussions around Ofsted and HSE, and also in terms of the contract for school meals, that actually some kids are going to get a hot meal.
I mean, to be honest with you, we do challenge the DfE on a number of fronts. In terms of visits to Ofsted, I have my own view about that. I'm not entirely convinced that that's currently useful. And I think even the visits that Ofsted are making at the moment, which is around the response to the coronavirus and how schools have risen to that challenge, I think although it's interesting, I think there's other means of actually gathering that information from schools without necessarily having an Ofsted inspector to do that. We did raise the HSE contacts and visits with the DfE, because again, it just seemed to us an additional layer of checks and balances that weren't necessarily required. We were reminded that the HSE is the statutory body with responsibility for health and safety in schools, and despite our best efforts, some of those visits still seem to have continued as part of that. In some schools, it has been and is possible to provide a hot meal, and where that's not possible, I assure you, it's not through any deliberate choice. It's more to do with operational issues. Our partner provider, Taylor Shaw in the city, have actually supported us in keeping a number of other schools not part of their contract open. I can think of another academy trust where Taylor Shaw, which haven't got a contract with them whatsoever, at very, very short notice were able to provide food in order to actually enable that school in that academy trust to stay open. We had the spectacle of senior leaders in that school actually doing basic food hygiene training over the weekend in order to actually learn how to safely provide food in their school or setting, and that is obviously less than satisfactory. So on occasions like that, then yes, we did well to actually get any food to that school at all, and that was cold. And on other days, that is the reality of providing food at the moment. But our ambition is to continue to widen the provision of hot meals as far as possible. But you're right in to identify the fact that the catering services themselves are not immune to infections. As part of the guidance covering the workers in school kitchens, they don't wear PPE as part of their working practice, and clearly they work relatively physically closely to each other. So that does make them vulnerable if one of them becomes infected to the whole of that team needing to self-isolate, which is really some of the issues that we've had, Alison.
Okay, thank you.
Alison, just to say that you can't underestimate the logistics, because if you're working in a bubble system, then so for instance, we have now reintroduced hot meals, and instead of taking an hour for all my 270 plus nursery children to go through, it took for the first week took 2 hours. I've now got it down to 1 hour 40, and that's with not just the usual lunchtime staff, but teachers and their teaching assistants helping as well, because you can't have mix and match, and you have to keep the integrity of the bubbles and the cleaning in between, which so therefore some schools, many schools would like to offer the hot version, I'm sure, but can't logistically, because it would take about 4 hours to give the meals within their school.
One of the things that we've trialled in a couple of schools I'm involved with is the bubbles come and sit down and are served. And that saves an awful lot of standing around and time taken.
Can I just come in with, we're in the Taylor Shaw contract with all our 6 schools. We've got small dining rooms, and it's just not practical to get 500 children through a dining room with cleaning in between each bubble and social distancing. Children are eating in situ in their classrooms, and food is being delivered to them. And up to this point, that's been predominantly cold food, with our youngest children having a hot meal in the dining room. So that's how we've done it. But we've worked with Taylor Shaw that in the next 2 weeks, every child will have a hot meal option, but it will be served to them in the classroom in biodegradable takeaway containers from thermopots. I don't know what one of those is yet, but I'll be finding out about it. So there are ways around it, but it does take a lot of logistical organisation, as Kathy has said. And eating school dinners in classrooms is not ideal, and it puts another layer of cleaning onto us as well, and another pressure on staff in the classrooms and support staff in school as well.
Can I just...
And as to can I just come in on the Ofsted thing as well? We have 2 schools that are in what we call the Ofsted window, where we're expecting Ofsted, and we know that normal Ofsted is not going to happen until January. I think the official announcement has. Again, being in the Ofsted window is an additional pressure on schools, and we could do with a national announcement about what that's going to be in the future. We protect our bubbles really, really rigorously, and just don't see how that can happen in the current climate. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, just so you know, I've got HMI in the room next door as I'm doing this meeting. And so we've had they've been at Newfield today. It's actually been quite a light touch visit, but can't say we particularly look forward to it. But it's and we've had 3 HSE visits across the schools, and we've got 3 schools that are in the Ofsted window. So, I mean, I think it's difficult, isn't it? I suppose that my view is that I'm keen on focusing on what we need to do moving forward. We can look backwards and harp and complain, but reality is that schools need to stay open. Quality first teaching needs to be great. Got to manage staff absence, make sure kids are in, get some clarity about the outputs, and seeing if we can keep the wheels on the wagon moving forward, really. And I know that my trust, whilst we have obsessed on safety planning and whatever, we are quite keen on getting onto the conventional year if we possibly can, and trying to, because the reality is that 9/10 of the children are in here every day, and we've got to make sure that the offer to them is superb, as well as focusing on the remote learning and everything else. And so how schools maintain the day-to-day for the overwhelming majority of children against the context of the pandemic is the real priority. And these other things are annoyances, but that's the priority, really, I think.
Yeah, thank you. I forgot, Cliff, they were your, no, they weren't, they were Alison's questions. Have you, are you happy with the question, the answers to your questions?
Fine.
Okay. Colin Ross.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I start off with a comment and congratulations to all the schools involved, and actually Learn Sheffield, which is doing the job that it was set up to do, and really coordinating all the efforts, gestation through the citywide learning body and onwards there. And I'm really happy that the family of Sheffield schools
Thanks, Colin.
I mean, in relation to the different reporting routes, I would agree, Councillor Ross, it's less than ideal. There were originally 2. And Joanne will also attest to the committee that actually, as well as those reporting routes, parents obviously also themselves have access to 119. And there have been cases where there is conflicting advice given, where, for example, you know, a school might ring in an incidence and get one set of advice, and where the parent then rings 119 and is told something different again, and then the head teachers and school leaders are then left to arbitrate that. I am in particular, I'm more concerned, to be honest with you, less about the fact that there's 3 avenues to get advice, from the fact that actually the avenues now seem to be closing off, and the head teachers are being put in this position of having to make their own decisions. And that is certainly something that we are making strong representations to the DfE about. EHCPs do continue to be processed, and for example, in September there were more EHCPs completed than there were applications for EHCPs. So colleagues in that team continue to work through that list. There was legislation passed in order to actually flex the timescales on that during the pandemic, but that legislation has now ceased, and colleagues within that service continue to process EHCPs. And as I say, certainly in September, there were more processed out than there were coming in as part of that. In relation to elective home education, the committee will know from previous presentations that we've made to you about this, clearly there are, you know, parents for some parents, they make an absolute positive choice about electively home educating their children, and they do that for a variety of ethical, personal reasons, sometimes religious as well. As part of that, there is a large number of parents within this new cohort where they do cite concerns about coronavirus as being part of that. But what I'm flagging up is that we need to be careful not to be alarmist with those parents in terms of their choice that they make. So we do give balanced advice, and in particular, we do flag up the 12-week window that they have, and certainly the capacity that we've put in place, both through MAST and additional capacity in relation to provision. That is all about ensuring that parents are as well informed as possible about the choice that they've made. Inevitably, though, I do think electively home educating your child for a long term is different to what occurred in the summer term when schools were under lockdown and parents were educating their children at that point. In relation to Rycroft, it's mental health services are commissioned elsewhere in our team, but I will certainly, from this committee chair, pick up the concerns that have been raised around the commissioning of those services, reflect those back to commissioners, and again would be happy to provide an update to the committee once I've established that with those colleagues.
Did you see the thumbs up?
I think, can I pick up on one of the points, and I think Alison touched on it as well, about the support for schools. We are getting support, like we said, from the Sheffield City Council. Some of the support we would really like in schools obviously aren't coming into schools. So speech and language and ed sites aren't coming into schools. And I think, we've had children that have been off for a significant period of time whose communication has been affected by that, and that's proving quite difficult, because obviously that's written into children's EHCPs. So I can understand the rationale behind that because of bubbles and crossing bubbles, but I think it's something that just needs monitoring as we go forward, because we don't know how long this is going to be, and things that are written in plans are statutory that we have to provide. So it's just something to flag, but there's an understanding behind that we are trying to accommodate that as much as possible. They're doing virtual meetings, but obviously that direct face-to-face contact and that work with students isn't happening in school at the moment.
Okay. Just on that, Chair, if I may, obviously because the council still is working in emergency decision-making process, that actually, in terms of some of our staff who've been working from home, we obviously have to get permission from the incident management group within the council to return those colleagues to work. But we have got permission for educational psychologists to do that, and they are enabled to make on-site visits. Clearly, there's a slight backlog in terms of cases and work from before the summer holiday when they weren't doing that. But I hope that Sasha will be reassured that as and when it's appropriate for education psychologists to come and visit in school, they will do that. Both Councillor Mohammed and I have picked up from other places concerns around speech and language therapy colleagues not yet making visits into schools. And again, that's commissioned elsewhere in the council, but we have picked up conversations with commissioners to try and accelerate that. But obviously speech and language therapist colleagues are not employed by the council, they're employed by health services.
Could I ask then, as a recommendation from the committee, that you write to all councillors, because I think some of the issues we're talking about today don't just affect us as we just happen to sit on this particular committee, but all councillors will be experiencing some of these things, is that you are aware of the situation with regard to speech and language and some of the other issues affecting special schools, and that you are trying to deal with that and explain how difficult and the reasons behind the difficulties for that. And it would be helpful as well, while we're here, if we could have some explanation from whoever about Reigate, because that, as you rightly point out, Reigate has got issues almost seemingly on a permanent basis, but this is this is something else, isn't it? That particular situation. So I was wondering if you could take that away with you and have a think about it, and that I'm putting that down as a recommendation from the committee, if the committee's agreeable with that. Yeah. I'm getting thumbs. No, they're all thumbs and there's no fingers. So I think that's okay. All
I'll
right.
certainly pick that up with Councillor Mohammed afterwards, Chair, so that we ensure that a communication to that effect goes out to other elected members.
Thank you. And whoever else needs to know. Right, thanks. Sorry, I'm getting a bit confused at where I am. It was Colin, wasn't it, last time? Are you okay with what you've heard?
Yes, thank you very much. And it's Andy next, Chair, I think.
I know it is. I've got a list and I can read. Thank you. Andrew, where are you?
Thank you, Chair.
Your mate's looking after you, you know, have you noticed?
Yeah. Well, thanks. I need looking after. I mean, the most important thing is that schools stay open until we get back to some sort of semblance of normality, and that seems likely now to be, you know, the whole of this school year. We're going to have to operate this way. So somehow, whatever tier we put in and whatever circuit breakers are put in between now and next July, we have to try and find a way of keeping schools open and keeping the learning happening for as many children and young people as possible. I mean, that's got to be the aim. And I think I think there's been some very good questions and answers. So sort of just to build on a couple of points. I mean, one is to try to understand what happened in that hard lockdown in the earlier part of 2020 is the gaps in learning, which very much follows follows people's family backgrounds, and the whole purpose of schools is to push everybody up so that every individual gets the opportunity to do what they can in life. So I'm really wanting to know how we can make sure that learning continues to happen, because it sounds to me like schools are having to juggle so many balls, and understanding where we're going to be in terms of exams and assessments, whether that's at that key stage 2 or key stage 4 and key stage 5 exams. Huge challenge in terms of making sure that the learning is going on and that we're able to assess these young people and keep their mental health stable in some sort of way. The second, we talked a lot about food banks, but the other part of that is free school meals in holidays. I noticed the Welsh Government has just announced that free school meals in all holidays are up to Easter. Is there any more pressure we can put on the government in terms of backing Marcus Rashford's latest campaign in terms of free school meals to make sure that those entitled to it get fed through both the coming half-term holidays and then Christmas holidays and the spring term holidays?
Could I again interrupt? And if you don't want to answer this question, I can absolutely understand it. But what would your preferred option be in terms of next year's exams?
So was that aimed at me, or it seems?
No. It was aimed on the back of the question because you mentioned the exam situation, Andrew, and I thought I'd just stick that on the end of it.
I think from a special school point of view, definitely that we need to look at some form of being able to look at work that students do over the year. We have had students who have struggled to come back. We have had gaps in education, and I think that, and I speak from a parent and a head teacher here when I say that the mental health of students is being dramatically affected by the fact that they are having to isolate, they've missed so much work, and there seems to be a lack of understanding in government about how that impacts students. To be able to try and catch up 7 months of work, then to come back to school to be told you've got to self-isolate again for 2 weeks and potentially have to self-isolate again, the uncertainty is going to create significant mental health issues in our students, and I think that has to be acknowledged.
Thank you.
I think in primary, which is the sector I work in, the primary schools that I work with would look to wanting teacher assessment in place for the end of this year instead of the key stage 2 SATs, but that's just our opinion in our trust. But I think I would want it recognised as a valid route of assessing children's progress, and then that the secondary schools don't start testing in Y7, because that's just delaying an exam from one place to another. So but that's what we'd be looking at, and I'd like it to be put on the national agenda, because at the moment Key Stage 2 has not been mentioned at all in terms of testing.
Key Stage 1 hasn't either, and the if you're aware that the phonic test that they would normally take in year 1 has been obviously didn't take place, so the lucky children not get to do it in December. And actually, you know, whether that's actually best use of children's time at this moment in time. All schools will be doing phonics, but actually the phonic test actually tells me very little about what the children are doing. I don't need them to be doing that test, but it is one more thing in an already stressful situation. And to put it in context, you talk about, obviously I'm an area, my school serves an area quite a lot of affluence, but in terms of the catch up, it's still there. My current Y2s, before lockdown occurred in March, sort of high 80s, say might have been where they needed to be sort of in reading, and now 53%, so a drop of over 30%. I mean, that's in the context, and that's with parental support and you know, lots of facilities at home. And I'm sure that's therefore those kind of results and to kind of drop and needing to catch that and take it will be throughout Sheffield in many areas.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I'd agree with primary colleagues around teacher assessment for primary schools. I think that makes perfect sense. But teaching the whole broad curriculum as we would do, and collecting really strong evidence, which we can do. Secondaries, I think we need a plan A and a plan B, and we need the conversation now, really. You know, I still think we don't know what the year will pan out to be. I think moving it back is potentially helpful, but we need more thought around how terminal examinations could be constructed to potentially provide some equity. But we actually need a plan B if that's not possible. And that suggests that, you know, mock exams that are due in 3 weeks' time, we need some clarity around, you know, the system undertaking similar sorts of assessments and collecting similar evidence, particularly for 11s and 13s, where those outcomes really are life-changing. So we need the debate and we need some clarity. I mean, my view about if I was teaching Y11s at the moment, you know, I'm still talking about completing the whole course, working really hard, catching up gaps, doing my best, not changing that, but, you know, with the reality that we need something that maybe we can put in there that will reflect the changing circumstances. I think it's the wrong thing to say at the moment that we're not going to be, but we need an alternative as well.
Okay, thank you very much.
I find it very difficult to reconcile the fact that these kids have missed 6-7 months of work, and a couple of weeks in June, July is going to make all the difference.
Me too. Andrew.
On Councillor Sangar's question about free school meals in holidays, Chair, as you know from my written report, we've pressed at every school holiday, the government and the DFE, around extending free school meals into the school holidays. At the moment, they are adamant that's going to not going to happen at the half-term holiday, but it's a little dance that we tend to do with them. So I started in September asking about free school meals in the October half-term holiday, and with a week to go at the moment, those do not seem to be going to be provided.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Andrew, have you finished for now? Yeah. So Andrew Sanger, sorry.
I mean, very, very much welcome what Andrew Jones has just said, and we just got to keep up the pressure in terms of free school meals in holidays. It's really important that everybody's fed during these times. But in terms of teacher assessments, I mean, clearly that's the way to go in terms of Key Stage 2, in terms of GCSEs and A levels. It's just about supporting the young people as much as possible. And just as you say, have a plan A and a plan B and a plan C. But it is life changing. It's really important for those young people who are where they are in the exam system.
Yeah. Okay. Khaltoum.
Hello, thank you,
I wish
Chair.
people had stopped moving around. It's very difficult.
Yeah, it's when people leave, it comes up, and then so our faces change to different position. Thank you. I had a question, and I think Andrew, you answered in another group that I sent it to. So I was concerned about parents because of home transmission to school. Obviously, schools are doing amazing work, and I really do appreciate, as a mom who uses 3 schools across the city, I really do appreciate everything teachers have been doing. I know loads of burden and loads of difficulties have been given to the teachers to deal with, and the school management and this education department. As of today, one of my youngest children is in his bubble. He has to come home, and I had to pick him up, which means I had to drop everything off, including telling the chair that I might disappear at some point. That means that we have other things to do, so another child to pick up, and that is a burden. And I think Kathy mentioned that there are other support that the schools are giving. I did ask about the face covering, Andrew, through somebody else, through one of our labs. And although schools cannot force parents to wear face covering, I wonder if the public health is looking at maybe giving that nudge to parents, because the home transmission to the schoolyard is actually one of the things that have not been touched, although it's not compulsory. Maybe perhaps it's something to support the schools, is for parents to have that awareness. If they could wear it in a shop, could they wear it in the playground as well? And that's for both Councillor Mohammed and for Andrew, to see if we can try and support schools in educating the parents really and supporting. I know not everybody can wear face covering as well. I take that on board. What we did was, in my school, we asked the teacher if we could ask the parents, and she sent a letter, and majority of parents are wearing them when they can. So that's something else that we can support the schools to have. Thank you, Chair. That wasn't a question, it was a thank you for all you're doing. And this is not normally my committee, so I'm quite enjoying this meeting. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome to come back.
Thank you. Maybe I'll join you next year.
Yeah, let's hope so. Yeah. Right. Mike, at final 8, Mike Levery. And he's gone. Where is he? Oh, he's there.
Here.
Hello
Hear me.
there. Hello.
Okay. I've just had 3 questions. I've crossed most of mine off because most have been answered, but a bit more on catch-up, please. There was a lot of concern that pupil premium kids would fall behind the rest over the lockdown period. Has that been the case? And particularly those who are in Y11, are they able to catch up and do the curriculum so that they are exam prepared? So that's the first question. The second one's to do with citywide data on absence. Are we actually tracking it citywide in terms of, for example, classes that have to be sent home, staff shortages and that sort of thing? And have we developed any contingency plans should pressures come on schools that means they are potentially going to close? And the third question is about operating models. Some of the larger secondaries, the logistics are very challenging, particularly when you've got engineering classes, laboratories to go to, IT suites. You can't just teach them all in the classroom in a bubble. Are we monitoring the most effective ways of doing this so that the larger schools can learn from each other on how they can operate as effectively as they can under the COVID restrictions? Thank you.
Chair, in relation to the first question on catch-up programmes, one of the things that schools are very busy and active in doing at the moment throughout this first half term is assessing children, young people as they've come back into school to ascertain their current levels of attainment and to see if there's been any hindrance in terms of their progress. So they're busy and actively doing that at the moment, and from that they will then obviously work out programmes of study around that. As we mentioned, schools will be allocated a sum of money from the catch-up programme, and colleagues are working with Learn Sheffield to develop and share practices with each other in terms of how we think
it's best to get the most from that. We're also working with external organisations such as the Education Endowment Fund as part of that to ensure that that continues to be targeted and we get the best effect from that. I can't therefore answer immediately the direct question as to whether children have fallen behind, because the schools are doing those assessments at the moment. Anecdotally, I think it's mixed. I think it does depend on what they did in the summer in terms of their home learning, what resources they had access to, and a whole range of factors around that. But I've heard of some children where they don't seem to have fallen behind as they returned, and others where they have. But schools are doing their best to get a pattern of that across the piece. The attendance data that we provided to you comes from an online portal which has been introduced by the DfE, and which schools are expected strongly, it's not mandatory, but they are expected strongly to complete a return into that on a daily basis. I'm sure that colleagues in schools might have some comments to make about that, but that a similar portal has been in place since just after the beginning of the lockdown, and that was in order to provide statistics to the government around attendance, but also in terms of particular issues in relation to absences by virtue of infections from the coronavirus. I think it's fair to say that the predecessor survey that was done each day before the summer was actually relatively complicated and onerous on schools. The DfE looked at that and introduced a slightly simpler version of that. But nevertheless, because it's not mandatory, it's not completed by all schools. It's probably completed by about 90% of schools. We were specifically asked by the DfE. We set off in March actually doing our own attendance tracking, and we were specifically asked by the DfE in I think about beginning of May to cease doing that, based upon the burden that was putting on schools, and also to avoid any confusion between different systems. But I have to say, I do think that the local collection system that we had in place until May was more accurate than the DfE portal that we're currently basing that on. Not least of which, the issues with that are related to the fact that it's a manual input of data. So schools have to take their existing attendance data, write it down, and then manually input it into a portal with the DfE. I mean, I can give you one example of that, which is a school a week or so ago that registered that it had on one day 32,500% attendance. And although I'm making a slightly glib point on that, what it then did was actually then skew all the data set for that school, and indeed as we collected it for everybody else. So our data team in the council are able to access the DfE data, but one of the things that they have to do first is to actually go through it and check it for errors and anomalies as part of that. I have suggested to the DfE that the management information systems that schools use in Sheffield, it's SIMS in a lot of cases. I'm not really sure. So, for example, the census that's going to take place next week, actually, the DfE have a system where they come in and harvest information from management information systems that exist in schools. So I'm not really sure why we're just not doing something similar on that in terms of attendance, because then actually what would be being input would be automatically harvested and collected and would be reflected of actual attendance in schools rather than a manual download and input in that. As well as the model risk assessments, moving on to the third question, Councillor Levery, in relation to good practice around secondary schools operating these larger bubbles, and in particular having to move children from class to class depending on the subject area. We have, as well as our model risk assessment, we are developing some case studies with secondary schools around good practice in that, so that that can be shared with other secondary colleagues as well as part of that.
Hey, Mike.
Yes, thanks very much. That's brilliant. Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to have to call a close to this particular item because about 4:30 somebody might literally pull the plug on us because there is demand for whatever we're in, this strange world that we're in from another committee. So, but what I want to do is just have a few minutes with the politicians or members of the committee in the room to talk about potential recommendations coming out of that, which there might be quite a lot because I've got a very long list here. So could I just say thank you to officers, Aptis, you're quite happy to stay as far as I'm concerned for this bit. And also to our colleagues from the education sector for taking time out of what is a very busy and testing and difficult time for you. Because you've got, not only do you have a job looking after children, you've also got families as well of your own to look after. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so could whoever's in charge take these people out the room?
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, is everybody gone? The reason I've asked for a sort of political few minutes is because I've got a whole series of things that I would like to do, and anybody else wants to chip in with some recommendations, I'd gladly listen to you. But I haven't got them precisely written down. But what I think I've gleaned is that we ought to be saying thank you to the individuals that came this afternoon, but also to everyone citywide for the cooperative attitude that they've taken, regardless of which type of school and which sector of the school, whether it be, first schools or secondary schools. So I think we should register that.
Absolutely agree with that, mate. Yeah.
I think we should register that and say thank you to them. I think what they were asking for was a serious discussion about exams next year. And I'm not going to go down on either side of what that should look like, but what they were asking for was some clarity and some clarity quickly, I think. So that's another thing I would like to get registered. Reigate, I mentioned, and I think Jason has put that down on the list of recommendations, that we need to have an understanding of what's going off there and hopefully a plan. The speech and language was also one that was raised, and I think they are going to take heed of that. I do want to flag up with somebody, and I'm not quite sure who it should go to, is about the home education situation, which is and has been for some time a source of concern, and now is a growing one, because I think for even inadvertently, some families are putting their children in a position where they're not going to catch up to everybody else. I'd also like to mention the free school meals in the holidays somewhere, and local collection of absence rate, which he said was actually more accurate and more useful than the national system. And the other thing I'd just like to, and other people can raise it if bring other things in. I'd like to send all of the information that we've seen this afternoon, the paperwork and the what do they call them, the slides,
the presentation,
the presentation to everybody, all councillors, because I think it's right and proper that they should see those, because they've all got kids in their areas at school. Is it possible, Jason? I've got this. Is this recorded?
Yes. I've made a note of the.
Is it possible to send the recording to councillors, or is that not technically possible?
We could certainly send them a link to the webcast.
Okay. Then they could get the chance to look at it, yeah, if they wished. All right. And the final thing is a question to everybody: who should we send these requests to? Because my initial reaction is to send them to the local MPs and say, please, will you bring this up in Parliament, or will you hit a Secretary of State over the head with something or whatever? So those are my feelings, and I'm happy to, you know, be advised by everybody else.
Chair,
yes.
Interestingly enough, in the work programme, we'd already got Reigate House, impact of COVID-19, accessibility to services, and actually homeschooling, impact of COVID-19, alternatives to schooling and safeguarding. So we'd obviously thought ahead of that. I'm not sure MPs are appropriate for all of those recommendations, because some are more at a local level than a national level. So I'm just thinking through, I suppose, well, Stephen Betts from Learn Sheffield was in the room anyway, but the director of executive director of, I was going to call them executive director of education, but that's not their title now, but you know who I mean.
Yeah.
For some of them, yeah.
That Jones bloke.
Yeah. No, John.
John McElraith.
John McElraith, yeah.
Okay, but in terms of general, what I've just said, what do you think? Somebody speak to me.
I agree, but as well as MPs sending anything, if it is national, can our own cabinet members send that as well?
Okay, we'll put a request that they do that as well. If you could,
sorry,
if you could use the chat, I'll go through the chat, please. If you want to speak, okay. Anne?
Yeah, thanks, Mick. I was wondering throughout the presentation about whether anybody would link in the work that the maths team do. I mean, they're integral to the work at schools. And they were mentioned, but not as much as I would have thought they should have been. In terms of absence, that's certainly one tool that maths collect on a regular basis, because we used to use it as an indicator for intervention work that perhaps was needed with families and children. Free school meals, similarly, you know, children in receipt of that was also an indicator for other work that might needed to be done with those families, particularly in terms of laptops and, you know, being able to get hold of any of the virtual school lessons that were being provided. So I just wonder whether we ought to send that out to the managers of our maths teams around the city and see if there's any contributions from them as well that might just make it a little bit of a more holistic picture. I do know that a worker from the maths teams was attached to every school in Sheffield, whilst also the teams were working with the known children and families that were already in receipt of care. But they also work very closely with Reigate as well. So a lot of the staff are also involved with the work at Reigate, along with the children, young people's, the mental health services. They're also part of the work that gets done with the maths team. So I do wonder whether we ought to extend it a little. I mean, Abtisam might want to say something about that, and maybe it's already been carried out, and some of the information that was in the presentation could well have been given by the maths team.
Okay, but can people make this quick, because I'm running out of time? All right, couple of minutes, please, each, if you don't mind. Mike Levery.
Couple of things, Chair. One is, I'm really impressed that they're looking at best practice in terms of how you logistically run the schools, and I think we should tell them that that's really good news. Major concern is they're still assessing catch up on the kids who are in the year 11. Now, if we get into half term and they haven't assessed all the kids who are playing catch up, they haven't a hope of delivering the curriculum. There's not enough time. So I'd really like to know what their recommendation is. I know Chris French said we'd still work on the basis that we get to the exams, but if they can't deliver the curriculum, how can they assist an exam?
Okay.
Okay, that's me.
Julie?
Just a couple of things, I think. The recommendation about free school meals, can we please add something on there about food banks? Because I know, talking to my own food bank, that people have stopped going there because housing officers, because citizens advice and places like that aren't open. People are finding it more difficult to get referrals, so they're not being used as much as normal. So I think we need to find other ways to make sure people know and understand they can still access food banks. I think the other thing that we need to really put on there is something that was said by one of the teachers in relation to, you know, we know what's coming, that we're going to have more staff absence, that we've got to sort out more remote learning. And I think we need to know from whoever what the plan is to deal with that, so that that is at the forefront of the mind and we're not just waiting to play catch up. Thank you.
Okay. Colin, are you happy just to note your remark? Yeah. Kaltoum? As brief as you can, please.
Yeah, very quickly, Chair. I think the Reigate issue is really quite urgent, because the backlog being that much, and I know we've got Mass Team and Reigate on your the work plan, but I think the schools have been suffering, and also I think the admissions have also not been meeting. So I think we need to try and find out what's happening with the Reigate, support these schools. Thank you for putting that on the list.
Peter Price.
No, sorry, Chair, it was for the officers. They've gone now, so forget it.
I do apologise, Peter.
No problem. No problem.
Genuinely didn't see you.
That's all right.
And Sophie.
Thanks. Yeah, I was wondering if we could revisit, if even if it's in the form of a report sent via email, the case of digital exclusion for children. I'm still a bit concerned about what the officers were saying about the laptops and the dongles not being taken up, but it does seem like it's not properly finished being administered yet, and to press them a bit too far on it now might not be that helpful, but maybe in a month or so when we know where we're at, and they might be able to give us some better statistics, because the one thing I didn't get answered was how many children are digitally excluded. I was quite concerned about Andrew Jones mentioning the algorithm. I'm sure there are children who are falling through the cracks, but I would just like a bit more clarification on the scale of that, and if there's anything we can do to help at a later date.
Okay, right. Thank you very much for your brevity. My suggestion now then is, now that Jason and Alice and myself have probably got a record of that we meet up and put something together. If you'll trust us to put something together that reflects what we've just said and sends it to the appropriate person, because they'll need to go to different people depending on what the issue is. So if you're happy with that, I'm quite happy to do that. It'd be me, Mike Levery, Alice, and possibly Jason to do that. Happy? Thank you. Alice, would you like to briefly go through the work programme?
Yeah, well, you've got it. It's on, you can hear me, can't you? It's on page 60, really, the list of topics. And as several people have said, it feels like it overlaps with some of the big issues. What I was going to suggest is, what's not there very obviously is CAMS, and that could be part of Reigate House, so it'd be a bit of an update like you had before. You might want to add that in. We'll make it and then there's something about, I think, the whole exam educational disadvantage, and that is definitely an item where the Youth Council could be very heavily involved, and I'm going to try and see if we can get something on that actually for your next meeting. along with it might be with MAST, it's a simple update on what's happening at the minute. And I think the other big one that's come out is probably homeschooling. So my suggestion to you, you've got 3 meetings left. My suggestion to you is roughly those exact scope of those, maybe they'll overlap, maybe they won't. Stick with that, and I'll work with officers to try and find the best days of your 3 meetings to do that. I can tell you now that in terms of youth services, I've been advised that the best time to get an update is the meeting towards the end of January, because by then structures will be much clearer as to what is actually happening structurally and operationally within house. But it's clear now who's come in, and I don't know whether actually that's another one just for a little bit of an update for you guys through a simple email brief about which services are in and which services are not.
Yes, please. Okay, I'm sorry about that's all a bit rushed, but it was quite a meaty subject that we've taken on this afternoon. I hope it was worthwhile. I thought it was. And I think, other than the next date of the next meeting, Alice, I think we're done.
Well done.
And that's actually in your papers on 61. That should be the 19th of November.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, unless
Thanks,
anybody's got anything particularly urgent, I think we can all go home now.
Can I just say
well done, mate.
I'm going to school governors at 5.
Thank you.
And
Really well.
Caltum, you're welcome.